I used to believe my existence was flawless, or at least I convinced myself it was. My name is Caroline. I'm 44 years old, married to a man named Richard who works in corporate finance, and mother to Sophie, a 21-year-old studying architecture at the State University 3 hours away. Before I unfold the rest of this night, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It really does help more than you know, and if you're drawn into stories like this, I want you here for every one of them. Also tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in a small town where the evenings fall slow and gentle, or in a city where the lights never quite go dark? For most of my adult life, I believed I had everything figured out. The house was immaculate. The garden was tended. The dinners were prepared on time. The holidays were celebrated with appropriate enthusiasm, but somewhere along the way I had stopped feeling. Not stopped caring. I cared deeply about my family, my home, my responsibilities, but feeling. That raw, electric sensation of being truly alive. That had faded so gradually I hadn't noticed its departure. Until the summer everything changed. Mason was Sophie's closest friend from childhood. They had grown up together on the same street, attended the same schools, shared the same circle of companions. He had been at our house countless times over the years, birthday celebrations, study sessions, holiday gatherings. I had watched him transform from a gangly teenager into a confident young man without really paying attention. He was simply Mason. Sophie's friend. A fixture in the background of our family life. But that particular afternoon in late June, something shifted. He stood at the edge of the pool, water streaming from his athletic frame. The golden afternoon sun wrapped him in a luminescence I had never observed before. His shoulders had broadened. His jaw had sharpened. There was a self-assurance in the way he carried himself that seemed entirely new. With effortless confidence, he ran a hand through his damp hair and looked directly at me. I held his gaze for a second too long, and when he offered a faint smile, I knew he had noticed. I should have looked away immediately. I should have retreated inside and pretended nothing had occurred, but I didn't. Instead, that moment lodged itself inside me like a spark, waiting to be ignited. From that day forward, I became painfully conscious of every movement he made. The way he laughed, deep and genuine. The way his eyes lingered on me just a fraction longer than necessary. The way he seemed to find reasons to be in whatever room I occupied. He started visiting more frequently, working on a summer project with Sophie in the garage, lounging by the pool on humid afternoons, moving through our kitchen with a familiarity that made my pulse accelerate. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was a middle-aged woman projecting fantasies onto innocent interactions, that the attention I thought I sensed was nothing more than polite friendliness. But deep down, I knew better, and I was terrified of what that knowledge meant. Then came the first touch, accidental, fleeting, but intense enough to make my entire body tremble. One afternoon, while Sophie was out meeting with her academic advisor, Mason came into the kitchen to retrieve a beverage. I was slicing tomatoes at the counter, preparing a salad for dinner, when he reached past me for a glass from the cabinet. His fingers brushed against mine for just a moment. The contact was minimal, barely a second, but the atmosphere between us thickened instantly. Apologies. He murmured, his voice low and deliberate, but the warmth in his expression told me he didn't truly mean it. I swallowed hard. No problem. The words emerged steadier than I felt. He poured his water and departed without another word. But long after he left, I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin. That evening, I sat by the pool alone, observing the moonlight dance across the water. My mind was a battlefield of guilt and longing. I was a married woman. I had built a life with Richard. A good life, a stable life. I shouldn't have felt this way about anyone, least of all my daughter's friend. And yet my heart raced whenever Mason was nearby. Faster than it had in years. Faster than it raced for my husband anymore. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a midlife crisis, a hormonal fluctuation, a temporary madness that would pass if I simply ignored it. But rationalization did nothing to quiet the restlessness that had awakened inside me. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, not as a wife, not as a mother, not as the woman who managed the household and attended school functions and organized holiday gatherings. Just seen, and that feeling was more intoxicating than I wanted to admit. The days that followed were filled with stolen glances and unspoken tension. Every interaction carried weight. Every casual exchange felt charged with subtext. When Mason helped me carry groceries from the car, his hand brushed my lower back. When I handed him a towel by the pool, his fingers deliberately grazed mine. When we passed each other in the hallway, he would hold my gaze just long enough to make my breath catch. None of it was overt. None of it could be proven or pointed to as evidence of anything improper, but the energy between us was unmistakable, and we both knew exactly what was happening. Then one evening, as I wiped down the kitchen counter after dinner, Mason appeared in the doorway. Sophie had gone upstairs to take a call from another friend. Richard was working late at the office, as he often did. The house was quiet. Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "You work too much," he said softly, almost under his breath. I let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That's just what I do." He stepped closer. "Maybe someone should take care of you for a change." My breath caught. I should have laughed it off. I should have redirected the conversation or excused myself or done anything to break the spell of that moment. But I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just stood there, cloth in hand, heart pounding, frozen between what I wanted and what I knew was right, until Sophie walked in. The moment shattered like glass. Mason turned to her with an easy smile, as if nothing had transpired. They started discussing plans for the following day, their voices fading into background noise. But something had happened, and we both knew it. The days passed in charged silence. Every interaction was heavy with what remained unsaid. I began avoiding Mason when possible, finding reasons to be elsewhere when he visited. But avoidance only intensified the tension, made the forbidden feel more desirable, made the dangerous feel more exciting. I started dreaming about him, vivid, unsettling dreams that left me disoriented when I woke beside Richard. I caught myself replaying our interactions, analyzing every word, every glance, every accidental touch. I was losing control, and some treacherous part of me didn't want to regain it. Then came the moment that threatened to change everything. Sophie went out to run errands one Saturday afternoon. Richard was at his weekly golf game. Mason stayed behind, claiming he needed to finish some research on his laptop while waiting for Sophie to return. I was sitting on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching clouds gather on the horizon, when he came outside and sat down beside me close. Too close. "You seem different lately," he said, studying me with an intensity that made my skin flush. "Are you okay?" I hesitated. "I just have a lot on my mind." He leaned in slightly. "If there's anything I can do." His words trailed off, but I understood exactly what he was offering. The air between us crackled with possibility. This was it. The threshold. The point of no return. Something inside me broke in that moment, not in the way I expected, not into surrender, into clarity. I looked at Mason, really looked at him, and saw not a romantic interest, but a young man barely older than my daughter. I saw someone who represented excitement and novelty, but not depth, not history, not the kind of love that sustains a life. I saw a fantasy, a beautiful, dangerous fantasy that I had been using to escape from the harder work of examining what was actually missing in my life. And suddenly, the spell began to crack. "Mason," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked at me, anticipation flickering in his eyes. "I'm flattered, truly. But this, whatever this is, it can't happen." His expression shifted, confusion, perhaps a hint of wounded pride. "I didn't mean to, I know." I interrupted gently, "And that's the problem. Neither of us meant for this to happen. But I'm twice your age. You're my daughter's closest friend. And I'm married to a man who doesn't deserve what I've been allowing myself to feel." Mason was silent for a long moment. "Is that really what you want?" he asked finally. I considered the question carefully. "What I want is to feel alive again. What I want is to matter. What I want is to be seen and desired and cherished." I paused, feeling the weight of my own honesty. "But chasing those things with you would destroy everything I've built. It would hurt Sophie in ways I can't even imagine. It would end my marriage. It would make me someone I don't want to be." I looked at him directly. "The things I'm missing, they're not things you can give me, Mason. They're things I need to find within my own life. Within my marriage. Within myself." Mason sat with that for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more respectful. "I think I understood that," he admitted. "On some level, I got caught up in something. You're not like anyone I've met." "I'll take that as a compliment," I said with a small, sad smile. It was meant as one. He stood, and the energy between us shifted. The charge was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Recognition, respect, an acknowledgement of what might have been, tempered by acceptance of what couldn't be. "I should probably head out," he said. "Tell Sophie I'll catch up with her later." I nodded. "Mason." He turned. "Thank you for understanding, and for not making this harder than it needed to be." He gave me one last look, a look that held gratitude, perhaps even admiration. "Take care of yourself, Caroline. Figure out what you need. You deserve to be happy." And then he was gone. I sat on that porch for a long time after he left. The clouds had gathered into a gray mass, and distant thunder rumbled across the valley. I felt empty and full at the same time. Empty of the fantasy I had been nurturing, full of questions I had been avoiding for years. When had my marriage become routine? When had I stopped sharing my true thoughts with Richard? When had I started measuring my worth by how well I managed the household rather than how fully I lived? The answers were uncomfortable. But discomfort, I was beginning to understand, was often the precursor to growth. That evening, after Sophie returned and Richard came home from golf, we sat together for dinner as we always did. But I observed my family differently. I watched Richard, really watched him, and saw not the distant workaholic I had reduced him to in my mind, but a man who was also struggling. A man who worked long hours because he didn't know how else to express love. A man who had retreated into routine because I had retreated first. A man who still looked at me sometimes with an expression I had stopped noticing. And I saw Sophie, my brilliant daughter, on the verge of her own adult life. I wondered what lessons I was teaching her about love, about marriage, about self-worth. I wondered if she would repeat my patterns or learn from my mistakes. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, I found Richard in his study, reviewing documents as usual. I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering courage. "Can we talk?" He looked up, surprised. We rarely initiated conversations anymore. We simply coexisted. Of course, I sat in the chair across from his desk. "I've been unhappy," I said, "for a long time, and I haven't told you because I didn't know how. Or maybe I was afraid of what would happen if I did." Richard set down his papers, his expression unreadable. "I've been unhappy too," he said quietly. The admission shocked me. "You have." He nodded slowly. "I've felt you pulling away for years, and instead of addressing it, I worked more, avoided more. I told myself that providing for this family was enough, that if I just kept everything stable, eventually things would get better." His voice cracked slightly, but they didn't get better. They got worse, and I didn't know how to fix it. We talked for hours that night, really talked. The kind of conversation we hadn't had since the early years of our marriage. We spoke about disappointments and unmet needs, about assumptions we had made and resentments we had harbored, about the distance that had grown between us like ivy, slowly, silently, until it covered everything. I didn't tell Richard about Mason, not because I was hiding something, but because there was nothing to confess. Nothing had happened. What had happened was internal, a reckoning with my own desires and dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with a young man and everything to do with me. But I told Richard about feeling invisible, about yearning to be seen and desired and appreciated, about losing myself in the role of wife and mother, until I couldn't remember who I was outside of those identities. And he listened, really listened, for the first time in years. That conversation didn't fix everything. Years of distance couldn't be bridged in a single evening, but it opened a door that had been sealed for too long. In the weeks that followed, Richard and I began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding. We started dating again, actually dating, not just coexisting in the same space. We went to dinners where we talked about topics beyond logistics and schedules. We took walks in the evening, rediscovering the neighborhood we had lived in for years, but never truly explored. We sought counseling, something I had always resisted but now embraced as necessary. And gradually, painfully, beautifully, we began to see each other again. Mason still came around occasionally. Sophie's friendship with him continued unchanged. But the energy between us had dissolved. When we interacted now, it was friendly but neutral. The charge was gone. The fantasy had released its hold. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an expression that might have been regret or admiration or simple curiosity. But I no longer analyzed those moments. I no longer needed them. By autumn, my life looked different. Not dramatically transformed. I still lived in the same house, still managed many of the same responsibilities. But internally, everything had shifted. I had started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned 20 years ago. I had joined a book club, not because I needed to fill time, but because I craved intellectual stimulation and connection. I had begun therapy on my own, exploring the patterns and beliefs that had led me to seek validation in dangerous places. And I had started speaking honestly, to Richard, to Sophie, to myself. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but authentically. One evening in October, as Richard and I sat together on the back porch watching the leaves fall, he reached for my hand. "I almost lost you, didn't I?" he said quietly. I didn't answer immediately. "We almost lost each other," I replied finally. "We were both drowning, just in different ways." He squeezed my hand. "I'm grateful we figured it out, before it was too late." I looked at the man I had married over 2 decades ago. The man who had frustrated me and disappointed me and taken me for granted. The man who was also the father of my child, the partner in my life, the person who knew me better than anyone. The man I was choosing again. Not out of obligation, out of love. The summer I looked too long at Mason changed everything. But not in the way I expected. It didn't destroy my marriage, it saved it. By forcing me to confront what was missing. By illuminating the darkness I had been avoiding. By giving me a choice that clarified what I truly valued. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But that's not always a tragedy. Sometimes it's a beginning, a chance to walk through different doors. The ones that lead not to destruction, but to healing. The ones that require honesty and vulnerability and courage. The ones that were there all along, waiting to be noticed. I used to believe my life was perfect. Now I know perfection isn't the goal. Connection is. Authenticity is. The willingness to look at what's broken and choose to repair it rather than run toward something shiny and new. I'm not a cautionary tale about desire. I'm a story about waking up. About recognizing the difference between what we think we want and what we actually need. About understanding that the spark we seek in others often exists within ourselves, or within the relationships we've stopped nurturing. If this story resonates with something inside you, I hope you'll pause and reflect, not with judgment, with curiosity. Ask yourself what might be missing in your own life, what doors you might be avoiding, what conversations you haven't been brave enough to have. Because some lines, once crossed, truly can't be uncrossed. But the line I almost crossed led me somewhere I didn't expect. Back to myself, back to my marriage, back to a life that feels more honest and alive than it had in years. And for that, despite everything, I'm grateful. If this story touched something inside you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this remind us that our darkest moments often contain the seeds of our greatest growth. Thank you for being here.